We talk about human rights all the time, but what about the rights of animals, the ones we share our home with, eat or experiment on? Do they deserve their own rights or even political representation? That's what we are going to talk in today's episode of The Green Wire, podcast by Center for Environmental and Technology Ethics, Prague. And my guest today is Dr. Friderike Spang, a philosopher and researcher who works on animal ethics, democratic representation, and political theory. Friderike, welcome and thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Martina. Thank you for having me.
Friderike, when we talk about animal rights, what do we really mean today?
So when we speak of animal rights, the idea is basically, that animals should have legally enshrined rights that protect them. And there have been different advances in the literature in animal ethics. For example, quite influential has been Donaldson and Kymlicka's book Zoopolis, in which they propose differentiated animal rights they differentiate between domestic, liminal, and wild animals. So domestic animals basically mean all the animals that we live really with us, in the sense of pets, or also factory farmed animals that we use, animals that we oppress as well. And liminal animals are animals that also live with us in a sense, but are not as, maybe even in our awareness, maybe like rats or street animals that are not, that we don't really
want to touch.
Yeah, maybe that could be one way to characterize it. And then wild animals, of course, it's pretty self-explanatory. And so for Donaldson and Kymlicka, the idea was to differentiate between those groups in order to attribute different kinds of rights.
And should there be some basic rights for all animals?
I think so. I would strongly.
And what kind of rights it should be?
That's that's the question of debate in the literature. But so what I would say is that once we conceive of animals as we could even conceive of them as persons, right? Which is something that has been advanced. And I would agree with that, even though it's sometimes part of a dispute. But once we conceive of animals as persons, then the question is what kind of rights emerge from that kind of classification. Because, when we speak of a person, then, we say that this person has a moral status, and therefore that person can be wronged, it can be harmed. So, and that would then transfer to animals as well. So, and once we agree on that, then I think it would follow that, animals would have the kind of rights that protect them from harm, especially from suffering, just like it does for humans. And of course, humans and animals have kind of, different capacities, different needs, different desires, different interests. So I would agree, I think, with those voices that argue for different rights for animals rather than the same rights as humans, which is kind of difficult oftentimes, or doesn't even make sense. But so for example, there's been this proposal to give animals voting rights, which I think it's quite unique and also maybe difficult.
But how to do that, actually?
Yes, that's from a normative perspective, one might agree that animals, because they are so deeply affected by many policies and legislations, they should have a right to also influence those legislations and decisions with a vote. But it's then in practical terms it's very difficult, of course.
You have mentioned different groups of animals, like domesticated animals used in research. What kind of rights these, for example, two groups should have according to your research?
What I'm looking at is how can we give them a voice in political decision making. And I would say that I wouldn't even distinguish actually between those three groups in terms of that particular aspect, in terms of how they should be represented, because it doesn't really matter if an animal is, a cow in factory farming, or let's say a mouse in a research experiment, or if it's a deer in the wild. If there is a policy that will affect them, let's say a rewilding proposal, or an animal experimentation legislation, or welfare legislation pertaining to factory farming and so on, it's always, I think, the case that these animals, if they are affected by political decisions, should also have a voice in, shaping these decisions. And I think from that regard, I wouldn't make a distinction between the groups.
But how to give them the voice, because they obviously can't speak?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question, because so recently there has been a huge, I would say, debate about the question if animals cannot speak, and right. So one might even say that it's more likely that we just don't do enough to listen and to try to understand what they are saying. For example, there have been proposals by Eva Meyer, who is also a very engaged person and also an artist as well, and she has actually been kind of really engaging with animals to try to understand them, and it's really fascinating what she found, and I think it's really also a matter therefore of us trying to to listen to animals, right? It's not only about just presuming that they don't have a voice, because they do have a voice, and I mean, they communicate all the time. Animals can be quite chatty and noisy. I would say that it's then a matter of us trying to understand, getting their perspectives, offering them options to express themselves. And
but are you willing to do that?
Am I personally willing to do that? So it's actually something I've also...
That's good to know, but I mean generally.
Yeah. So, I think this is really important question that you're asking, right? So, I mean, who is willing to do that? Because when I read Eva Meyer's book, I was really very fascinated. So I've read this book very recently about doing philosophy with animals, children, and the sea. And it's really fascinating because she's putting a lot of effort and time into communicating with animals and trying to understand them or actually understanding them, right? Really, they are having some kind of communication, but I don't think it's realistic for everyone, and some people don't like animals, which is also completely fine, right? They wouldn't want to engage with them and try to understand them. So that's actually something that I try to. Therefore, I think it's important to bring this kind of trying to understand animals question to the political level, because like on a daily basis it's I think impossible for people to do that in the depth and the detail that Eva Meyer does and their commitment. But I think it is possible to have animals represented in the political sphere by someone who is willing to do that. And we don't need to have every single person to do that. We just need some people who are devoted trustees, I would call them, and do that.
Who will be the authority deciding what their rights should be, and who should be the one overseeing the law?
I think it can, and I think it should come from different directions. So, I mean, one obvious angle would be to have, like an animal party in parliament who is kind of, pushing for animal rights. And so far, I mean, there are animal parties in different countries, but it's very tough for them as well. And usually they don't have a lot of power. And
they are sometimes considered to be activists, right? More than like politicians.
That can also, that's a good point. So that can also kind of make it difficult for them to be even accepted, maybe. But I don't think it should, or it's only that, right? I mean, it can also come from like a more bottom-up pressure from the public, from animal NGOs, from like individuals being committed. And academics as well. So I feel like working in the field of animal ethics, animal politics is kind of really rewarding also in that sense that it has this very practical impact or can have it, and also kind of really trickle into society, which is actually, for example, why I'm collaborating with an animal NGO. It's a network. We're meeting regularly and trying to think about strategies for bringing animals into politics. So I think, therefore, it's really kind of important to kind of make this practical connection as well.
Why do you think animal rights remain such a controversial topic, even in societies that care deeply about ethics and justice?
Well, I would say it has been very difficult to answer before, but there is research, especially in psychology, that gives us a better understanding of why people are so hesitant to kind of, embrace animal rights or, not eating animals, not consuming animal products. And it's this research about meat-based cognitive dissonance. I think it's super fascinating because it relates this kind of refusal to see, what it means to eat a steak or like animal products, and it's very common, and it's so deeply ingrained in our societies and culture that it's really difficult to kind of break through that barrier. So for one thing, it's accepted as normal. It's accepted as necessary. Even some people think that we can't have enough protein if we don't eat meat constantly. It's nice, people usually kind of come together and have a nice meal, and that includes like animal products. And yeah, it's normal, right? So people think this is how it's done. So those are the four ends which have been identified to kind of also kind of explain why people tend to not really see beyond the problems that emerge from consuming animal products. And I think this kind of research explains very nicely why it's so difficult, even for humans, who care deeply, who are compassionate to each other, to animals that they their pets or animals that they like. So it's not, I think, a trait of human nature to be cruel. To the contrary, I think it's really difficult to kind of just accept that there is something not nice or normal about
that we don't like suffering.
Yes, yeah, we don't like suffering, right? So and then that's really a contradiction, right? So we oftentimes really try to help people and or other animals as well, and yet we implicitly kind of request and endorse suffering by consuming animal products. So for that reason, I think it's very contradictory and difficult to understand. But I think this kind of new research helps us at least a little bit to grasp why we do what we do.
So let's talk about emotion a little bit more. Mm-hmm. Can anger ever be politically or ethically productive, or does it inevitably risk turning into aggression?
Yeah, what is the role of emotions in activism in general? And also I've been looking specifically at animal rights activism or vegan activism as well. I've been considering this in the framework of what I call deliberative activism, right? Deliberative democratic systems are quite supposed to be open and inclusive, because the question of animal rights is a very emotional one, right? It's affecting people to the core, and especially animal rights activists who have been, like personally experiencing some of these cruelties firsthand. But then also on the other hand, we have, the politicians, the industry representatives who also have strong stakes in these debates and are also often very emotional. So coming from that perspective, my worry was a little bit like if these, because there's always this kind of ideal that deliberative processes are supposed to be reasonable and respectful and, mutual listening, which can, of course, happen and should happen. But it's unfortunately true that many animal rights activists have been deeply affected emotionally by what they've been witnessing. So many activists actually also go into the field and have very personal experiences, especially when it comes to factory farmed animals or, animals being experimented upon. So there has been, for example, this research showing that it's been done by Jesse Prince, for example. He called it the emotional basis of moral judgment, right? So he says basically that if we form a moral judgment, it's immediately clear to us that we are right because this judgment is based on kind of an affirmative emotion. And then so what we think is informed by emotional processes. And so I've been trying to think about that when considering these kind of deliberative venues, these settings where there are people who have not only, kind of emotionally charged backgrounds from their experiences, but then also from their moral judgments that are at stake. So let's say the animal activists would obviously have the judgment that, animals should have rights, animals can suffer, animals, should not be treated this way. And then we have the industry representative who obviously sees it very differently. And I think that could even maybe also be framed as a judgment, as a moral judgment. And so I think from that perspective, it's so difficult to not only to kind of keep emotional outbursts maybe in check, but also to really change your mind, so to speak, which is of course ultimately the goal of these deliberative processes, or maybe find a compromise as well. But oftentimes the idea is someone has to change their mind, or meet the other person at least halfway. So and that can work, depending on the topic, right? But if it's this kind of, and animal rights, I think it's a really good example for these very emotional topics, where then we have those, people trying to deliberate, to come to a consensus maybe. But if all the parties feel that, what they think is not only right, but really feel it's right, like viscerally, like emotionally. It's very tough, I think, to kind of find an agreement from these from that background. So my point was less that it's not possible to kind of deal with these emotions or these kind of maybe emotional hindrances, but more to just be aware of it and try to maybe train even to keep them in check, so to speak.
My another question is, if you see some changes in this kind of attitude, if you see that activists and politics are willing to control their emotions and just try to talk to each other?
That's a good question. So for me, I think this scenario that I and other animal ethicists or people working in the field of animal politics envision, it's not really been happening a lot, actually. So this idea of bringing actually to the table people from the animal advocacy background and from the animal industry, it's still more of an ideal. And so basically what I did in this paper is to kind of address even this, ideal situation and try to just caution a little bit about the potential interferences that things that might not even be completely in our control might have also on these situations. But so far, unfortunately, it's not even the case that we have a lot of these kind of deliberative interactions between those opposing parties, which I think it would be very important to have, and would be could be very effective also for the animal rights movement. To do that. So it's something that I would strongly advocate for, to have these kind of exchanges deliberatively and democratically, to think about bringing together even very opposing parties. I think there's something really important about that. I think it's just also important to be clear about that it's not going to be easy, and that there might even be some kind of problems arising from things that people might not even be aware.
Friderike, do you see parallels between the animal rights debate and other social struggles, for example, civil rights or environmental justice?
Yes, absolutely. First of all, parallels are for sure. I think there are many oppressed groups in our society, not only non-human animals, but also migrants, for example, are very oppressed. Women still are often facing more challenges than their male counterparts. And so I would say that there are significant parallels. I think more importantly that it's also interconnected, and there has been some some strong claims, I think, been made about how oppression of animals is also related, for example, to gender violence, because it's often the female animals as well that are being mistreated, like cows, for example, female cows being artificially inseminated, which is very painful and unpleasant for them. They're not being asked if it's okay to do that. They're just, it's just being done to them. And it's often the female animals that suffer a lot. Also, the calves being taken away from the mothers. So that's something that is really very painful, also emotionally, for the animals. And so I think we can see that. There are some parallels as well, for like in terms of the the gender that is being oppressed, and also there have been claims made that this can kind of also frame public awareness about it's okay to kind of, if we treat the cows like that, then that can kind of transfer to perception of a woman as well. So I think it's crucial to bring these kind of movements together and and think about how they can kind of, abandoning one oppression can also benefit abandoning the other. So I would definitely say that there are parallels and connections.
So it's all connected in the end.
I would say so, yes. And, like children's rights and rights for humans with cognitive disabilities, for example, that's also been connected to the animal movement, in the sense that oftentimes these are also groups excluded from political participation, and it's not entirely clear if it's justified, and some people tend to think it's not justified, and so I think that's also quite emerging field of research, and I'm really curious to see what will be discovered, and I think that will be really interesting to see, because I think it's another dimension where we can really see like parallels with other oppressed groups or excluded groups, and also future generations, of course. If you think about environmental politics, it's rather likely that they will be more affected even than we are now. And so, what justifies us to exclude, their voices, their interests from decision-making processes? So I would say that, yes, absolutely, there are strong connections between other excluded groups and animals.
Could AI ever help us care better for animals and other groups? You have just mentioned, for example, by revealing hidden patterns of suffering or environmental harm.
Mm-hmm. That's super exciting area of research. So for me, I'm very curious to find more about that, and it's going to be actually hopefully a project that I will pursue soon. So to think about how we can use AI to kind of give animals a voice in political processes, and how that might be beneficial or maybe even harmful as well. And so the example that you mentioned is, and that's already something that is happening, right? So AI can be used, for example, to detect if animals are in pain, to detect unpleasant states of being. So it can, in that sense, I think it can be used already to at least, reduce suffering. And also quite, I think impressive and interesting is this research using AI in order to decode animal signaling, animal communication. It's been done with, I think, humpback whales and other animals to kind of find out more about, how they communicate. So that's also something I think that can help us to bring animals more into our realm of our human realm of society, of inclusion, of thinking about animals not as these distant creatures, but beings that we share a world with, right, that are affected by us. And for me personally, and my research that I'm hoping to do, it's really about bringing animal voices into politics, into political decision making, and using AI for that as well. So I think there's also a huge potential in terms of benefiting animals. For example, we could use AI to generate different data and deliberative processes that can be used to kind of better understand how animals would be affected by some policy, and to kind of have some, especially when we think about animals that are usually not so much in human, not where we don't feel so favorable towards to, like, for example, rats or animals that, are not cats or dogs, let's say. So I think then it's rather useful to have maybe AI like as a neutral kind of entity to give us an impression of, let's say, how rats or bats or animals that we don't maybe even know as much about, marine animals. There are a lot of marine animals that we are not, that we don't even have uncovered yet, and that we don't really have a lot of data on. So then, and that brings me to the limits, I would say, about using AI, because...
That was my another question. If you see any negative sides of using AI when we are talking about animal rights.
So I think it's very important to consider both the benefits and the risks. And my impression is that people are very skeptical about AI overall, and also justifiably so. I'm not kind of undermining that, but I feel that there might also be some potential here that we can use. But AI is trained on the data that we have created as humans, right? So in a sense, it's not objective or neutral. So, and then when it comes to animals like, as I said, marine animals, where we don't even have a lot of data gathered, because maybe they are so deep down in the ocean that it's been... until recently, I think, impossible even to kind of really detect or gather a lot of data. Then it's also, of course, difficult if you don't have the data. Then we also can't train AI on those data, and then it remains difficult to include those animals. So I think there are limits. But I'm still hopeful that, like for a lot of animals, we do have like significant data, and AI is just so much better than us in kind of just collecting huge numbers of data and summarizing them and just gathering those data in ad hoc situations, right? I mean, if we talk about deliberative engagements, it's very spontaneous. People interchange. It's not like, people have a lot of time to prepare. In those situations, it can be very useful to have something like AI, which is very fast and can just, provide insight into, let's say, some policy, how would it affect the animals, which animals would even be affected. It's not something that, everyone involved would necessarily know. So I think, speaking of the benefits is also something that we should do.
And my last question, do you think we are slowly moving towards a society where animals will be recognized as a part of the moral and political community?
Good question. Slowly,
very slowly.
Very slowly. I mean, it's hard to tell. I hope it's moving in that direction, and but I think it's also a little bit an up and down kind of development. So I wouldn't be too optimistic that it's like an upwards movement only. But for example, if you look at the number of vegans or vegetarians, that's been quite increasing, also with some fluctuations. Yeah. But overall, it's increasing, I would say. And if you also look at the numbers of vegan restaurants or generally vegan options or vegetarian options, I think it's much more common these days than it has been, let's say, a few decades ago. So in that regard, I think, there is some reason to be kind of optimistic. And also just from a more academic perspective, there is much more research now on animal ethics, but also speaking of the political turn, I think there has been so much research done and so much progress that hopefully will trickle into society at some point. So, I would say I'm very carefully optimistic, not utopian optimistic, but I mean, you mentioned slowly, and I think that's hopefully the case.
Friderike, thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you so much, Martina. Thank you for having me.